Making dumb groups smarter. There's a saying that two heads are better than one. If so, then three would be better than two, and four better still. With that being said, one would think that with 100 or 1,000, things are bound to go well. This statement puts an emphasis on the wisdom of crowds. However, studies have shown that that is not always the case, and oftentimes groupthink occurs, which is simply groups going astray. Next slide, please. I am Tanisha Herman, accompanied by Yulliana Sosa, Cindy Nguyen, and Isabella Tamayo. Next slide, please. There are four main errors that lead to groupthink. These are amplifying errors, cascading effects, group polarization, and what everyone already knows. Next slide, please. The problem with working as a group. Groups fail to live up to their potential at decision-making. Instead of aggregating the knowledge and wisdom of their members, they tend to make bigger errors than an individual would alone. Next slide, please. Why this happens. Group members take informational signals from what others say, despite the information being wrong, and they also allow reputational pressures to silence themselves or change their views in order to fit in. This causes groups to amplify individual errors, stampede toward bad decisions, and ignore information that isn't already widely known. Next slide, please. Psychologists Daniel Kamenan and Amos Tversky have identified mental shortcuts known as heuristics that lead individuals astray. Instead of one person using these mental shortcuts, the entire group often does this, and this leads to the downfall of group work. The main errors that are used in groups are the planning fallacy, representative heuristics, overconfidence, and framing effects. This completes my portion. I will now hand things over to Isabella.
So I will be discussing the cascading the wrong answer. So the meaning/definition of the word cascade effect would be a process whereby something, typically informational or knowledge, is successfully passed on. So there are essentially two categories when it comes to the cascade effects in groups. One would be the informational cascade and the reputational cascade. Cascade effects in groups typically means that the group members typically follow along with statements or actions of previous groups members to avoid any judgment or questioning of why they agree differently. Cascade effects do alter perceptions of a process or product of an activity, and we see that with these two examples. There are some risks of cascading effects that are not necessarily about groups, but to give an example, we have that if there are dangerous pesticides, waste dump, or an act of terrorism, those all can be used in a similar effect where if we hear a lot of people talk about the topic in a certain way, then we may have a certain tendency to agree with them since we do not want to go into too much detail as to why we agree differently if we do. That would be obviously a negative effect for a cascade. A positive note, however, would be that let's say there's a new show that has just been released on Netflix and all of the coworkers are saying that it is so good and binge-worthy, then there's a strong chance that you would also want to watch that show since there are so many great reactions towards it. In the article, there are two types of cascade effects. One is the informational, which would include when people tend to silence themselves out of deference to the information conveyed to others. The other type of cascade effect would be the reputational cascade, which would essentially be when group members silence themselves to afford opprobrium of others. The examples of each would include that for the informational cascade, there is a jury deliberation example, which is a strong application for business. The jury deliberation conducted by Hasty is a study consisted of dozens of mock jurors that were from a big city pool. The volunteer jurors were able to write down their verdicts prior to the deliberations and also mention what their confidence levels were. Then as the deliberation begins, the jurors were then able to see which verdict was the most popular by a straw vote. Of course, one of the groups had 3 jurors and the other had 1. The fourth of the jurors was caught off guard and did not have an explanation as to why he chose the verdict that he did. He just stated that it is simply second degree. The example for the reputational would be that there is a project that is contracted and there are 2 managers that agree that the project has a high rate of success, but there is another manager that does not believe so, who states that she agrees with the other 2 managers. She did so that she does not receive any criticism or any judgment for the opinion that she has. That is because she cares about her reputation. Reputational cascade is common when it comes to there being women talking about fashion, for example, and then there's a man that is also in the conversation, but he does not know much about the topic, but does not want to disagree so he doesn't get bashed for his thoughts. It is also mentioned by the author that when understanding cascade effects, availability is key. An idea is able to move from one person to another so quickly, which can then produce a huge spread of belief in the group. That concludes my PowerPoint, so now I will pass things off to Cindy.
Hi, my name is Cindy, and I'll be covering the third reason for poor group decision-making, group polarization. Group polarization is taking out positions more extreme than before deliberation. Every person is entitled to their own opinions. However, when a person is exposed to a risky shift is more likely to occur. And when a person is exposed to a cautious shift is more likely to occur. An example of a risky shift is moving to a new city. A cautious shift would be contemplating to ride a roller coaster. Next slide. Polarization is made up of three principles. The first is informational signal. The first disposition taken in a group would inevitably skew the opinions of the group. The second principle is reputation. People care about their public image and change their positions to match the general public's viewpoints. Lastly, we have certainty. When speaking in a group, if others come to the agreement with your viewpoints, it erases any uncertainty that person previously had, giving them a newfound confidence. Next slide. And an example of polarization today, most notable is congressional polarization. In the chart, we are able to see Democrats become more liberal and Republicans become more conservative within the last 50 years, as both parties have become more ideologically cohesive. Studies also show that geographic demographic affects the opinions of people, going back to the risky versus cautious shift. Because of the ideals people were originally exposed to, more Republicans come from the South and more Democrats are from the North. Overall, group polarization is the idea that people tend to have extreme viewpoints of what they initially believed after deliberation. And this ends my portion of the presentation. I would like to pass it along to Yulliana.
Focusing on what everybody knows already. Next slide, please. According to the article, this problem may be the most interesting of all. This is due to groups not taking into account critical information that only one or few people have. Instead, they concentrate on what everyone already knows. Next slide, please. And this creates hidden profiles. Hidden profiles are a product of the common knowledge effect, where information held by all group members has more influence on group judgments than information held by only a few. Next slide, please. In a study of hiring by high-level executives, the experimenters did not control that information the executives had about the various candidates. Instead, the executives did their own information searches. As a result, some information was known to all, some was shared but not by all, and some was held by only one person. Next slide, please. The study found that some group members are cognitively central, in that their knowledge is held by many other group members, while other group members are cognitively peripheral, in that their information is uniquely held. To function well, groups need to take advantage of cognitively peripheral people, but in most groups, cognitively central people have a disproportionate influence on discussion. Next slide, please. Making groups wiser. The goal in group decision-making should be to aggregate information that members actually have and don't let faulty information signals and reputational pressure get in the way. Next slide, please. To make groups smarter, the author suggests these actions: silence the leader, prime critical thinking, reward group success, assign roles, appoint a devil's advocate, establish contrarian teams, and use the Delphi method. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the key to smarter groups is information aggregation. Different people take note of different parts, and if those parts are properly aggregated, they will lead to groups to know more and better than any individual. Next slide, please. And this is our works cited page. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you.